Today, Clarissa Barnes, the director of the Hench Autism Studies Program at the Defiance College in Ohio, joins us to talk about topics of college readiness. Are there conversations that families should have before jumping into a college search?
There are a couple big questions that families need to start looking at. The first one is, what are kind of what I would call the short-term goals for students? But when I say short-term in this sense, I mean in the next 3 to 5 years. What are the goals? If a student has an idea of here's where I would like my career to be, and we know that a college degree is needed for that career, then I think the family needs to start looking at, okay, so what are different types of college options, thinking about 2-year community colleges, 4-year colleges, looking at, is full-time maybe the best option for my student, or is part-time the best option for my student, which would then kind of limit geographically where they may go depending on what they're doing, and really looking at that piece. If a student is interested in a career, obviously, where college is not necessary, there's not a need for a 2 or 4-year degree, then starting to look at, okay, well, how are we going to prepare for that type of career? If a student is not sure, which is not uncommon, right, when we're talking about 17, 18-year-olds or even younger, really then starting to research a variety of different options. I think the best thing that families can do is don't rule out any of the options initially. Start to gather some general information about all of the options, meaning, employment immediately after high school, vocational training, looking at 2-year institutions and 4-year institutions. Because then when you're starting to dig into, okay, well, these are the specific supports we're looking for, you can start to see which different options offer those types of support. We've had students come to us who kind of feel like they want to go to college just because it's the next step. It seems like a lot of people are going to college, but there's not a real passion to continue their education. And college is a very expensive investment if it's not something that a student is passionate about, interested in, and then is potentially necessary for their next steps. So I always encourage families to really kind of think about, what are we looking at in the next 3 to 5 years, and then starting to look into the individual factors related to that student about what would fit them next based on the avenues they can take to get to their goals. Is that student looking at full-time or part-time being ideal for them, meaning number of classes they're going to take per semester? Is a student wanting to only take 2 or 3 classes per semester, which would be more of a part-time schedule, or are they wanting to take 4 or 5 classes per semester, which would be more full-time? From there, based on that decision, then we're looking at, again, kind of geographically, where are we going, where are those options located? A lot of times when students are going part-time, they may be living at home or close to home, and then when they're going full-time, they may be more of a residential situation, like Defiance College. But I think that's the first really important decision. From there, I think really starting to look at, okay, if we're thinking maybe that a 4-year full-time, college student experience is going to be the best fit for us, then looking at, in what areas outside of academics is my student going to need support, and then starting to really dig into which programs offer that type of support. Again, this goes back to the idea that students have different levels of autonomy when they're in high school in terms of what they're doing in kind of navigating their own supports and what's being adult directed. And families really looking at that when that student leaves for college, there isn't, the supervision that might be available at high school or home to really kind of stay on that student of, hey, you need to be doing this, make sure you're doing your laundry, make sure you're doing your homework, make sure you're, waking up in time for class. And so we really want to think about, where is that student going to need help building in those supports and which programs offer those. Similarly, you want to think about the size of the school. As I mentioned, Defiance College is a small private liberal arts school. So we are, a small campus, really relationship based. So students are going to have the same faculty oftentimes in multiple classes. We have a faculty advising model where faculty in the major area of study advise students academically and get to know them. Our staff on campus and student life know students very well. So if a student on our campus, for example, is not coming to class, it becomes very apparent very quickly. And there are sometimes some conversations like, hey, I haven't seen so-and-so, since last week. Have they been coming to your class? Whereas at a larger school, like a large state school, where there might be, upwards of 100 or more students in a class, there may not be that recognition when a student maybe isn't attending something or is having a little bit of a struggle in a particular area. And so in that sense, I would say, if you have a student who is going to struggle to advocate for themselves, a smaller community might be a better fit because people are going to identify when something's not going well and may be able to approach the student, versus a larger school where the student really has to advocate for the support that they need. Yeah, I think the biggest thing for students is really recognizing that they are the ones who need to kind of direct and be responsible for everything. So sometimes I'll, have students who come to a meeting with us and they say, well, I'm not really sure, what I have to do with this assignment, but I think they'll just tell us in class. And then we have to remind the student, okay, well, let's go back and look at your course syllabus. What does it say about this assignment in the syllabus? Let's look at the learning management system. What does it say in the learning management system? And then if they don't find the answers, reminding them that they need to be proactive and they need to be the one to reach out to the instructor versus wait for the instructor to reach out to them. Similarly, if a student isn't, if they are sick and they can't go to class, that they need to be the one to reach out and let faculty know, hey, I'm not going to be in class today, I'm not feeling well, and that it's kind of their responsibility to figure out what was done in class that day and what they need to make up. Whereas in high school, a lot of times they get back to school and their teacher's kind of like, hey, here's what we did, let me get you caught up. And the same thing kind of goes for the residence hall, right? So it's going to be up to that student to keep their living space clean, to manage, you're in the dining hall, you have the freedom to eat anything that you want, but how are we going to make sure that you're eating things that make you feel good and don't end up making you feel sick, and making some of those choices. And again, a lot of this is for all students, not just students in our program, but how do you handle that increased responsibility in a way that's going to, not lead to a lot of unintended consequences or consequences that you're not looking at. The other thing that I would say is a big transition for a lot of students when they get to college is we've seen an increase, essentially, I think it started during the pandemic and has kind of persisted, that there are a lot of safety nets related to different types of failure in high school. So opportunities to maybe turn something in if they've missed a deadline, or, kind of more consistent reminders from adults in their lives. And for a lot of students, understanding that, there are going to be times if you forget to take a quiz that was online for a class and that, the instructor said that quiz must be taken by this date, then there may not be an opportunity to make up that quiz. And so really helping students to navigate the differences in the severity of consequences, and, the idea that a 0 on a quiz is not what you wanted, but you still have the opportunity to do well in the class, and how to move forward from some of those different experiences can be really important for students to build if they haven't had the opportunity to learn those skills in their high school careers.
Are there steps families can take prior to college to help their student prepare? Yeah,
so as families are navigating this process, I think there are two really important things that families can do leading up to the transition to college before their student actually moves on to campus. One is making sure that student is actively involved in the entire search process. So a lot of times, obviously it's a lot of information gathering early on. And so I'll get a lot of calls from families, hey, we want more information about your program. I'm happy to speak with those families. But I always like to see at some point prior to the application process that the student is also involved in those conversations. So whether that might be, oftentimes what it ends up looking like might be a phone call with the family, and it's a parent just gathering some more information, doing kind of a preliminary screening. Do we think this is a school we might want to visit and a program we might want to investigate further? And then usually after that comes a campus visit, or if distance is prohibitive, we might do a video call. And at that point, I really like to see the student involved so that the student can hear what types of services are available, they can ask their questions, and they can also start to indicate their willingness to participate in a program like ours. Our program, for example, uses peer support models. Some students have no interest in that model, and so they know off the bat that's not going to be of interest for me, even if it sounds really great to my family. So really including the student in that initial search process, again, prior to applications, is really important. The other piece is in that kind of investigation process, as a student starts to articulate, hey, here are my preferences. I think this school looks really great. I'm really interested in this type of program. Working with the student and their support team, being, their high school team, the family, obviously the student, and looking at, okay, what might we need to start doing differently in high school to prepare the student to be successful in that environment? How can we give the student more opportunities to be self-directed? And what tools can we put in place that they could actually then take with them to college? There are so many great options now relative to apps and technology, so that it doesn't have to be, mom or dad reminding the student, but the student can set their own reminders, for example. And those small changes make a big difference, because then that's a transferable support to that college environment.
How can parents best support their students after they've transitioned to college?
Once a student has made that transition to living on campus, right? So they've gone through that process, they've selected the school that they think is the best fit for them, and they're there on campus. I think the biggest thing that families can do is, make sure that they are trusting the decisions that their student has made and they've made with their student, and giving their student that autonomy. A lot of families really want to be able to, stay right on top of what's going on with their student, much like they did in high school. And as an example, a lot of families are really used to in high school, they can see day by day what assignments their student has submitted, where their grades are in each class, and they might be used to monitoring that as part of the support team in high school. When a student gets to college, at Defiance College, we use a learning management system called Moodle, but all schools use web-based learning management systems. And so the student has the login to that system. The parents don't have the login, but a lot of students we've found will share that login information with their family. And so then the parent is able to log in and kind of look at different classes and see exactly how their student is doing. And then when they see their student hasn't done an assignment yet, they might give them a phone call and say, hey, you need to do that assignment for your psychology class, or you need to do that paper for your history class. I saw you haven't done it yet. And I think that the goal there is to be helpful to the student, but it really decreases the opportunity that student has to build those skills themselves. And so we really encourage parents to try and back off of much of that as possible, and really use, if you think you need to be that involved with your student, do we maybe need a step between high school and college for your student to build those skills for independence? Because you really want to allow your college student to be a college student, which can be very scary, I think, for a lot of families, because that comes with the possibility of failure, whether that failure is not doing well on an assignment, not being able to continue with a particular extracurricular, co-curricular, but it's really looking at how can we support your student to have that experience, learn from those consequences that happen, and continue to move forward with their support. So I would really encourage families to think about how can they build in what they need to be able to release that responsibility to their student, which is a challenging thing to do.
When would you recommend that families start this process?
Yeah, so honestly, I think the earlier the better, of course. I think that's to be said with most things. Really, if families can start maybe looking at these programs sophomore year, junior year, get really intentional about starting to dig into what different programs seem like the best fit, really start those visits. And then that gives all of senior year to make some final decisions, but also to really be working again with that student's team in high school at, okay, here are the goals that are really important to us so that we feel confident our student has the skills that they need to be successful in this next step of their journey. So again, an ideal situation would be start looking sophomore year, really get intentional about narrowing it down junior year, and then make final decisions senior year and be really working junior and senior year to build the skill sets needed based on where the student is interested in. I also know from working with a lot of families, some families may not have even thought college was an option because they weren't aware of certain support programs until junior or senior year. So I would also advocate that it's never too late to start looking and to be working with different programs. A lot of support programs in particular are really great at working with families to identify, particularly if they don't think a student is a fit, why they don't think they're a fit. And it might be a referral to, hey, have you looked at this program? Or maybe suggesting that the student take a year and build some particular skill sets in order to be prepared for college. So again, ideally start sophomore year. If you can't start then because of any reason, don't feel like you're too late to actually get going, because at any point you can enter that process.
Do you recommend any resources to help families with their search process?
Yeah, so I think two great resources for families. collegeautismnetwork.org is a great resource for families. It's fairly comprehensive in terms of the list of support programs, so you can kind of narrow down maybe geographically where you're looking if you want to keep the student close to home, or the student wants to stay close to home or live in a particular region. And so really narrowing down and looking at different programs. Another great resource is there was a documentary, I believe it was in 2020 when the documentary came out. It was called Autism Goes to College. They've got a whole platform now, autismgoestocollege.org. And through that, there's a podcast that is done by college students and students who have gone through this experience. And so I think that's really helpful for students and families to hear from folks who've actually been in their shoes. But they've also got a variety of resources. There's a blog and a couple other things on that site that I think is just helpful, especially to hear from that firsthand perspective from some of the people who've gone through these experiences, both at 2-year and 4-year institutions. In terms of finding out information, if I've got my heart set on a particular school, maybe they don't have a formal support program, or I'm not sure if they do. One of the best offices to start with always is going to be Accessibility Services, and really start to talk to them about what is available on campus for students with disabilities, and then particularly, are there any specific types of programs or supports for autistic college students? An increased number of schools are having not only their accessibility services, but also kind of disability resource centers and opportunities for students who are part of that community to really work together to share their experiences and build community. And a lot of students have reported those types of experiences have also been really supportive outside of formal support programs.
Is there any paperwork that should be completed prior to college?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I encourage all families to do is, legally, students who are receiving special education services need to be reevaluated every 3 years. And one of the things I would advocate parents do is, and their students, is really advocate for an evaluation senior year, or as kind of late as possible, so you have your most updated evaluation of educational needs for that student that you can take with you to college. So most applications are looking at those psychoeducational evaluations to be within the last 3 years. So technically, right, if I got one done my sophomore year of college, I can still use it for my application. But I always advocate it's going to be best when you've got that as part of your free, and appropriate public education, to get that evaluation done. And then you have that most recent evaluation with you to bring to school and use to help navigate your journey there with supports. The other thing is make sure that you've got, your updated IEP or 504 plan if you're receiving supports through special education services, and really make sure that you've got all of that information up to date and you've kind of discussed what's working, not working, and really flesh that out, because when you get to college, those are some of the documents that are going to help your support team kind of determine what's working, what's not working for you, and what type of support that you need. The other thing that I would strongly encourage families to do, and this isn't necessarily a paperwork piece, but a related piece that is so important. There's a lot of research related to this, but I can also speak from personal experience with students. If students are not already participating in some sort of counseling or therapy related to mental health, making sure that the student has an avenue to access that as they make that transition to college. One of the number one areas where autistic college students continue to advocate for a need is continued increases in mental health support. So college is a really stressful time for everybody, and it can increase the probability for burnout, and we really want to make sure that students have the support they need in those areas. And that can absolutely come from a campus counseling center, but it doesn't have to come from that center. So I always encourage students, if they are working with a counselor in high school and they've got a great relationship with that counselor, looking at, is it possible maybe to do telehealth with that counselor when they come to campus? Because if they've already got a plan in place that's working, we want to continue that for them if that's what's going to be beneficial. So that would be another piece that I would say is really important for families to navigate and kind of, even if a student doesn't feel that they need those services right away, making sure that if the need arises, we can put the plan in place right away rather than having to take the time to come up with a plan.
What are some questions to ask when visiting schools?
Yeah, so a couple of really important questions. I think first and foremost, looking at procedurally what's needed. How do I gain access to these different things? So that seems like a very obvious question, but again, because college is so different structurally, it's really important, I think, for everybody to be on board with what is the process for getting access to accommodations? What is the process for getting access to services? How does my student navigate this? As far as specific support program questions, I think a very important question for families is one that we've kind of talked about a little bit, which is how much contact will the family have with the program? And then looking at what will happen if a student is not engaged in services. So one of the really big changes for families and students is when a student comes to college, they are an adult, they make their own choices. So what that means for programs like ours is we can have support sessions scheduled. But if the student calls and says, hey, I'm not coming today, we can encourage that student to attend, and we absolutely will, but ultimately it's their decision to participate in that support session or not. If we give a recommendation for a student that they use a particular service or strategy, it's up to that student ultimately whether or not they're going to use that strategy. And so I think a really important question to ask is, what happens if a student, declines a particular service? What is the process that the program uses in working with the student, but then also kind of making decisions about continuing in the program if the student's not using those supports. One of the things we try and do as our program is really try and problem solve. Okay, if we're giving a recommendation that we think is going to help that student meet a particular need or solve a particular problem that they're facing, and they don't want to engage in that recommendation, is talking through what are the different options, why not this recommendation, and really looking at that piece, because some families I think are a little bit surprised by that there's not, it's so different from high school or anything prior to adulthood where there's a little bit more requirement of the student. This becomes all their choice and option. And so I think asking questions about how that's handled, what that looks like, and then making sure that there's kind of clear communication about those expectations.
Do you have any tips for families when evaluating colleges?
Yeah, so definitely mental health services, what's available on campus. I think really looking at, this is a little bit campus specific, but looking at where your student would be looking at going to school, looking at the surrounding community, whether or not your student is going to have transportation. One thing that I think a lot of families, they're so busy thinking about so many things as that student is making that transition, is they might not realize until their student calls home and says, hey, I'm not feeling well. I really think I need to see somebody, but the campus health center isn't open right now. What do I do? And so, well, if a family hasn't thought about that, it's kind of like, well, I don't know, where do you go when you're at school and you're sick if the campus health center isn't open and you think you need to see somebody, but it's not like an emergency room situation. So we have really been encouraging families to kind of just think about, okay, if I look at a week in my student's life, what are the services they're using, and have I made sure that they have access to those services on campus? And so it's going to be student to student, but really looking at how does that translate? And that can be really challenging because so much of that might be handled just by the structure at home, but really thinking, okay, what am I worried about when my student goes to school, or what is my student worried about? And then how can we ask questions about the supports that are offered there? And it's going to obviously, again, vary campus to campus. Large campuses tend to be more all-inclusive in terms of there are so many services just offered right there on campus. Smaller campuses like ours integrate some community resources, and so looking at what that looks like for the student as well.
Big thanks to Clarissa Barnes and Defiance College. Please subscribe to Inclusive Academia.